In this video, you're going to start integrating Firebase authentication into the Expensify application. Now, to do that, Firebase gives us a few methods we can call to do things like log in and log out. The only problem is that we don't have any user interface elements to wire those up to. So we don't have a login page with a login button. We don't have a log out button inside of our private pages. So to kick things off, we're going to focus on creating a login page component that is going to get shown at the root of the application. And then we're going to take the dashboard component and we're going to move that over to something like /dashboard. So we're no longer going to show this at the root. We're going to show the login page instead. Don't worry, if the user is already logged in, we can automatically redirect them over to the dashboard. And that's something we'll focus on a little later. So we've actually done all of this stuff before, so I'm going to give this to you as your opening challenge for the video. You're going to need to, 1, create a login page component with a login button. You don't have to wire up any on-click handlers just yet. I also want you to add a snapshot test for the login page component. Then down below, you're going to make sure to render that new component at the root of the application, and you're going to show the expense dashboard page component at something like /dashboard. So take some time to get that done. If I refresh localhost 8080, I should see the new login component with no header in place. And if I do go to /dashboard, I should see exactly what I have here. Pause the video, knock this out, test your work, and when you're done, you can go ahead and click play. All right, how'd that one go? Hopefully you were able to get everything set up correctly. I'm going to kick things off by creating the login page component that is going to sit in the source components directory. Right here, we can call it something like loginpage.js. Then we're going to set this one up. I didn't tell you what type of component to create, so you might have gone ahead and used either type. That's fine. We're not going to need state for this though, so we can use a stateless functional component. I am going to start by importing React from React. Now down below, we can set up our stateless functional component. I'm going to go ahead and use a named export, exporting a const login page. And I'm going to use a stateless functional component. There's no need for state here. And I can just implicitly return some JSX, wrapping it inside of parentheses and tossing the JSX right here. I am going to start off with a div. In that div, I am going to toss a button. The button text is going to be something like login, and there we go. We have our basic component in place. It does indeed show the button, and it is exported. Now we're going to focus on adding that test case over inside of tests components. We're going to make a new test file for this one right here. New file, login page.test.js, and all I wanted you to do was create a snapshot test. So we're just going to grab React and the shallow renderer from Enzyme and add that in. Import React from React. Import the named export shallow from Enzyme. Something we've done plenty of times before. Then we can add our test should correctly render login page. We only need one test case since there are currently no props, so there really is no way we have a dynamic test. There is nothing dynamic getting rendered. We can just add the one snapshot test, and we can start off by creating our wrapper and using shallow to render it. Now, what type of JSX am I trying to render? I'm just trying to create an instance of our component. Now, I am going to need to import that component we just set up, that is login page, and I happen to set it up as the named export, so I have to make sure to grab it as such. Importing the named export login page from, I have to go out of the components folder, out of the tests directory into the source components folder, and right inside of there, I have the file login page. Awesome. So we have login page imported and now we can use it. Login page. There is no need to pass any props since this one doesn't actually take any props. Then we can go ahead and actually add our snapshot. On the next line, we're going to get that done. Expect wrapper to match snapshot. Awesome. We have our wrapper matching the snapshot. This is all we need to do for the test case, so we can go ahead and run our test suite before making changes to the app router. Over inside of the terminal, I am going to kick that process off. I can clear the output, and I can use yarn test to just run it a single time. This is going to go through the process. We should see after everything completes that we have one snapshot written, and that is exactly what we're getting right here. So now that we have this in place, we can actually go ahead and focus on changing the app router. Over here, I'm going to use yarn run dev server to boot the dev server back up again, and I will switch over to the browser. making sure to leave this up in the background. And over here, we're going to focus on changing our app router. Remember, that lives in the source file. We have the routers folder. We have app router. This is what we need to change to make sure the login page shows up at the root of the application as opposed to the expense dashboard page. Up above, I am going to go ahead and import login page, import the named export login page from. In this particular case, we have to go out of the routers folder. We have to go into the components folder, and in there, we're going to have login page. Now we can actually render that at the root of the application. So all I'm going to do is remove the reference to expense dashboard page and replace it with login page. Now we do still want the dashboard to show up, just at a different route. So what we're going to do down below is add another instance of route for that. We're going to be providing the exact same two things we provide for all of these guys, the path and the component. For the path, we'll be using /dashboard. And for the component, we're going to be using the component that we just removed from up above, right here, expense dashboard page. Excellent. With this in place, we should be able to save the app router. We've successfully gone through all of those steps. We created the component, we added the snapshot test, and we switched up our routes. Now, right here, we are getting the login page. Currently, we are still getting our header, the header for the private page. We're going to ignore that for the moment. We'll come back and fix that a little bit later when we restructure things for authentication. For now, what's important is that we have the login button showing at the root of the app. And if I do go to /dashboard, I should see our expenses showing up, and that is exactly what we have. If you're seeing this, then you're all done the challenge. We can close down our little documentation file, and what we're going to focus on is the process of actually authenticating when someone clicks the button. In order to work with authentication, we do need to make some changes to our app in the Firebase dashboard. Right here, we have to enable that feature. So for the regular Expensify app, not the test app, we're going to go over to authentication. We're going to switch over to sign-in method, and here we have a few options. We have various social platforms, we have anonymous authentication. We're going to focus on Google. We all have Google accounts since we are using Firebase, a Google product. So I'm going to click that one, I'm going to enable it, and then I am going to click Save. Now, there are various settings inside of there that we may or may not actually need. In our case, we do not need these. We have the whitelists for client IDs. This is related to external projects, which we're not going to be setting up. And we also have the web SDK configuration. Once again, not something that we're going to be using. We're going to be focusing on using Google Authentication to just confirm a user is who they say they are. So now that we have this in place and we actually have the Google Authentication enabled, we're going to go ahead and start setting up functionality related to authentication. And a lot of that is going to need to start off inside of our Firebase file. Right here, we configure Firebase up above. We need to add another thing inside of here, creating an instance of what's called a provider. So a provider is a way to provide authentication, and there are all sorts of ways. We can have a Google one, a Twitter one, a Facebook one. There are quite a few different providers we can use. We're just going to be using the Google provider. In order to set that up, we just need to create a const, and I can do that right below my database, for example. A const. We're going to call this one Google provider, and I'm going to set it equal to a new instance of the provider. That would be Firebase .auth right here, uppercase G, Google auth provider. And this one, it takes no arguments in. So in this case, we're setting things up to authenticate with Google. We could use the GitHub auth provider to authenticate with GitHub. Now we can learn more about all of this stuff over inside of the documentation. So if we do head over to the docs, I'm going to open up the docs in a brand new tab. What we just used is defined under reference. Here we are going to look at the web reference. And in the past, we've always gone right to database. This time around, we are going to start using auth. So we are accessing the Google auth provider right here. There are other auth providers for the other social platforms. Now that we have this in place, we're actually ready to start authenticating. So what I'm going to do is export this as a named export right here, Google provider. And there we go. We now have the Google provider exported. I can actually switch this over to Google auth provider to fall in line with the class name. Now that Firebase is correctly exporting Google Auth Provider, we can focus on actually making some sort of function call that is going to start the authentication process. But before we do that, what I do want to explore is how we can track authentication. So we're going to be setting up the button to actually authenticate, but it would be nice to know if that worked or failed. So over inside of app.js for just a moment, let's add a few lines of code. These lines of code are going to allow us to run some sort of callback if Firebase actually logs in or if the user logs out. And we'll be refactoring and shifting this stuff around a little bit later. For now, though, we can just grab some stuff directly from Firebase. The only thing we need is the Firebase thing itself. We exported that as a named export Firebase, so that's what I'm going to grab. Right here, Firebase. Then we're going to add from, so we're getting something from that module. And all we're going to do, and we can do it down below, is access Firebase. Dot, and right here, what we're going to use is auth. We're going to call it as a function to get all of the authentication related functionality. And there is a method on here. The method is called on auth state changed. This one takes a callback function and it runs the callback function when the authentication state is changed, when a user goes from unauthenticated to authenticated or from authenticated to unauthenticated. And if there is a user, the user is provided right here. So if we want to confirm if someone logged in or logged out, we can just set up if user. If there is a user, we know they just logged in. Else, if there is no user, we know they just logged out. Console.log, log out. And then up above, we can add another one, console.log, log in. So once again, the reason I'm setting this up first is so we can actually make sure the other code we write works. If we do see these messages, then we know we are actually triggering the authentication related functionality. Now let's go ahead and actually make a call to log in with our Google accounts. We're going to be making that change to the login page component, but we're not going to add the Firebase call directly inside of here. Instead, we're going to make a new actions file up above. The actions file is where we can actually write the Firebase related stuff. The new file is going to be for authentication, so we can call it something like auth.js. And inside of here, we're going to start off with one thing we export, though we will be adding more later. We are going to export a const, so this is going to be a named export, and we're going to call it start login. So this is actually going to start the login process. It's not going to take any arguments. All we need to do is start the process, and it is going to return a function. So this is going to be one of our asynchronous actions, and right here, we are going to get access to dispatch. We can name that later if we ever actually end up using it. Inside of here, what are we trying to do? We're trying to call a Firebase related method, which means that we do need some stuff from our Firebase file. We need two important things. We need our reference to Firebase, so I'm going to import Firebase. From that file, I have to go up a directory. I have to go into Firebase right there. I have Firebase. And once we have Firebase from Firebase, a lot of Firebases, we're also going to grab the Google Auth Provider. Google Auth Provider. Now, we haven't talked much about auth providers because there's not a whole lot to it. We create the auth provider, and then what we do is we pass it in to a function, and this is what starts the process. So right here, I am going to return, just to return the promised chain, allowing others to attach onto it. We are going to access Firebase. Once again, I am going to call auth to get access to that authentication related functionality, like we called database previously. And the method that we're going to be using right here is called sign in with, and we're going to be using sign in with popup. So sign in with popup takes the provider as its first and only argument. So I'm going to provide the Google Auth Provider. This has the effect of saying, hey, I want to go ahead and sign in to one of my accounts, and I'm going to use the pop-up system where we display the little pop-up, you pick the account or log in, and then you're authenticated. And I want to log in with my Google-related services. So now that we have this in place, there's actually nothing left to add to this file, and what we're going to do is just wire up the login page button to actually fire this guy. Once we have that wired up, we'll be able to test out our functionality. Over here inside of the login page component file, we are going to be using connect, and we're also going to be using the action we just created, start login. So let's grab both of those. I'm going to import connect from, in this case, it will be from React Redux as it always is. And then we are going to import right here, the thing we just created, start login, was the named export from that file. So I have to go up a folder, out of source components, I have to go into actions, and in there we have auth. Perfect. Now that we have both of those things in place, we're actually going to set them up. This component doesn't need access to anything state related, so we don't need to provide a map state to props, but I am going to provide a map dispatch to props, since I do want to actually dispatch something. I want to dispatch start login. That'll be a const map dispatch to props. We are going to right here get access to our function. This function gets called with dispatch. Then we can implicitly return an object. We're going to be setting up just one thing on here, start login, and the start login prop is just going to dispatch the start login action. So I'll set up my function. Then I can go ahead and use dispatch, and I can dispatch start login as imported from up above. Perfect. Now that we have that in place, all we have to do is wire up connect. So I'm going to export. By default, I'm going to be exporting the connected version of the component. We can provide undefined for the first one, which would be map state to props, and I can provide my actual map dispatch to props variable for the second one. Next up, we just call that, passing in the component we're trying to connect, login page. Perfect. Now we do still have to add on click, so let's do that. We're going to add it right here, and when someone does click that button, we are just going to call the start login prop. I could actually just destructure that right off of props from here. Start login. Then down below, I can just reference it. Start login. Excellent. Now this file is all done, and what we're going to do is actually just change app router. So we do have this new default export. This is the connected version. I'm going to access that by changing app router and just removing those curly braces right here. Now we should be able to actually test things out. What we're going to do is actually run the dev server. The dev server should already be running. It looks like it still is. And over inside of the browser, I am going to do a hard refresh of the Expensify page. And I am going to switch over to the login page available at the root of the application, since we just wired up that button. Now down below, you can actually see that our function, the function that keeps track of the state of authentication, it actually has already fired, and we're seeing log out take place. So when we first visit the application, Firebase in the browser tries to communicate with the servers to see if you're already logged in. If you are, that means you can actually view private data without needing to re-log in every single time you visit the app. So what we're seeing down below is good. It means that things are starting to work. Let's see what happens when we actually log in though. So I'm going to click login, and what happens, it brings up the little pop-up. We did tell it to sign in with a pop-up, and then we can pick from our accounts. I have two I'm already logged into. I could log into another one if I wanted to. I'm just going to go ahead and use the first one by selecting it. This should go through the process of actually authenticating, and down below we are getting login printing to the screen. So if you are seeing this message, that means you just successfully set up authentication. We're not really using it yet to do anything meaningful, but it is indeed working. Now, if I do go ahead and manually refresh the browser again, we are going to have our message print right away. And this time around, you can see that by default, we are logged in. So we logged in previously. When we revisit, we are still logged in. So you should be seeing login here as well. Now that's where we're going to stop for this video. We have the basics set up in place, but there is still a lot more to do. So let's take just a quick moment to recap. In this video, we did a lot of stuff we've done before. We created new pages, we wired all of that up, so I'm not going to go into detail about that again. What I do want to talk about though is the new stuff we did. So right here, we set up our first provider. This allows us to actually set up Firebase to authenticate with Google. If we are going to be using the Google Auth provider, we also had to enable that over in the Firebase dashboard. Now this alone wasn't enough. What we really needed to do was actually pass the provider into a function, into sign in with pop-up. That is what triggered the pop-up, showed my Google accounts, and allowed me to pick one. Over inside of app.js, we also used something new, on-auth state changed. This allowed us to run this function every single time the authentication state changed, including when we first load the application. With all of this in place, we are ready to continue on to the next video where we're going to continue to integrate the Firebase authentication. I'm super excited to get to that, so let's just go ahead and jump right in.